This amateur footage was filmed at the start of the Second World War in France, in the midst of the battles of June 1940. A German column is advancing along a French road choked with refugees. When suddenly, a young French woman allows herself to be kissed by the enemy. There is also this unsettling sequence filmed at a barracks in the northwest of France, showing German and French soldiers fraternizing at the height of the occupation. Or the images of soldiers and civilians smiling and apparently having fun together. Watching these scenes of life in France under Germany, one would think the occupation had been light, even pleasant. These private films, never before seen in public, are owned by collectors and individuals on both sides of the River Rhine. What new do they tell us about the occupation? What is their significance? Seemingly innocuous, these films show another face of war. To try and understand them, we viewed them with their authors. I wasn't in awe of the Germans, but I wasn't against them either. I could come and go anywhere in France or Belgium. Nowhere did I leave a bad impression. The new images take us into the intimacy of families. Jews wearing the yellow star in Paris tell us of an amazing journey. A German who ends up siding with the resistance. I was, of course, conscious of living two lives. One as a brave soldier and the other as a fighter against fascism.
Die Arbeit gegen den Faschismus.
Behind their uniforms, how did the German soldiers really feel? What did the French think of them at the time? And how did they react to them? "70 years later, using only these amateur films, we revisit a painful period in French history from the perspective of both the French and the Germans. Her name is Jeanne, filmed in the winter of 1939-1940, 22 years old. A wonderful age. How could she have imagined that a few months later, in June 1940, she would find herself on the road and in fear of the traditional enemy, the Boche. We only knew them from what we'd heard about their behavior during the previous war. Horror stories about cutting the arms off boys. Atrocious. That's why we were fleeing. We were terrified. But at the same time, our running away somehow dishonored us. You must imagine that the Great War hardly left a single family that hadn't suffered a death. For me, all my uncles had one arm missing or a foot missing from that war. I grew up in that feeling about war, and in my head, The Germans would kill everyone. Here they are, the barbarians. Among them, Adjutant Gunther Flaum, then aged 20. I have to say we look to our front rather than to our right or the left. We were wary of being attacked on our flanks. Of course, sometimes you'd say, pity, it was a beautiful church and it's destroyed. But that was war. Proud and pumped with propaganda, they crushed the French troops. We've been very proud of it, it's true. But not exuberant, really. We gave it our all because we felt it was a matter of survival. Once France and Britain declared war on us. Hans-Georg Schultz wrote to his parents from the battlefield. It's really horrible for the people of this region. But why did the French want war? The Führer tried everything to avoid it. Now they'll have a funny surprise. They've already seen our superiority. In perfect order, the Germans enter village after village, as here in Collonges in eastern France. This amateur film was shot in secret from a skylight, an act punishable by death. The cameraman who died in the 1970s was Victor Barbe, a French customs officer. He was familiar with Nazi ideology. He had worked in the Tsar in 1935 and had brought back photos and some previously unseen films. It was a harrowing time. This is Hitler's first rally in Saarbrücken. In the early days of the occupation, he was one of the few to realize the true extent of the Nazi threat. For his neighbor, Suzanne Malek, the first Germans soon proved ordinary soldiers.
The
officers were very arrogant. I had met one officer, and, well, I shouldn't say too much. But the soldiers themselves were friendly. They were polite. Almost all knew a few French words, so they managed to communicate quite well. And being polite, they'd salute, and we'd answer them, we'd speak to them. We were expecting barbarians, but the truth is they were people like us. We were worried the first time we came across some Germans. I thought, what's he going to do to me? But they didn't do anything. It's the story of a misunderstanding. Reassured by the behavior of the traditional enemy, the French do not see or do not want to see the arrival of Nazism in France. On the surface, the Germans are well behaved, even respectful. as shown in this amateur film shot by Edwin von Rothkirch. The general, a member of the German military aristocracy, is shown here with his son at Verdun, the site where he had fought the French almost 25 years earlier. Are these Germans who bow before French monuments and the graves of soldiers of the Great War really so bad? Among the soldiers captured by the Germans, there are many who admit the German military was superior. The humiliation, the shame of being taken prisoner, because we were there to fight, to be stripped of our weapons and watch the success, the victory of the enemy, who then also captures you and puts you in camps. I was there to fight, not to run away. When I saw them and how organized and ordered they were, I told myself, we just don't measure up. We were emerging from a difficult period, the so-called phony war. And what had we done during the phony war, officers and men alike? We'd played a lot of cards. We had all been psyched up politically to go to war. Not the French, though. That's my impression. They fought. They said, we're soldiers, we must fight. But they didn't really believe in it.
Des Siegens, das war nicht so stark. Ja.
General von Rothkirch's film also has some upsetting scenes, which is a foretaste of Nazi racism. He films black prisoners who are hungry and squabbling over meat. The caption says a goat will be butchered and eaten raw. As if to demonstrate the supremacy of Germany. Everyone's filming them, and in between shots, captions with ironic comments. The great nation in the prison camps of Belfort, the caption reads. Are these the fighters for European culture, as the soldiers sarcastically wrote in their photo albums? Among the amateur photographers is Klaus Kendler, then aged 20.
I
went to France, and for the first time I saw a lot of colored people. In Germany, there were none. In Berlin, there was a single soldier from the colonial troops of the First World War. He lived in Zellendorf. He was the only colored man. I asked the prisoners, especially the blacks and the Moroccans, why are you here? They were surprised when they heard me speak French. They were trying to gesture to tell us they had no idea why they had to fight against us. This is a special announcement from the Führer's headquarters. Paris has been declared an open city. They marched and sang. You felt they were crushing us. I'll tell you something. I wouldn't say we admired them, but we'd watch them. We'd seen our own troops. Of course, they would parade and march, but this was still very impressive. It's a bit like in the movies, you could say, to see these people, all immaculate, the hair out of place, and marching along like that. Faced with an overwhelming German victory, France goes through the most serious identity crisis of its history. It's witnessed by the movies of the summer of 1940, here in Orleans, with the symbol of France, Joan of Arc. Barely 12 months earlier, the French army paraded here in front of the President of the Republic. It was more than a defeat. It was a collapse, with incalculable consequences. In northern France, 14-year-old Roger Tellier films the disaster. Troubled, and like so many French people, intrigued by German power. They seem to have such superb discipline, and that impressed many people. And the fact they gradually came to dominate Europe. They had the quality of organization, command, and strategy that we obviously did not possess. So there was some grudging admiration. We disapproved, but at the same time, we didn't think the French would have been capable of doing all of that. Handsome, tanned, at their ease. In their private films, the conquerors that move in the summer of 1940 seem disarmingly youthful and relaxed. For them, the war seems over. They triumphed in just 6 weeks. A miracle. And it's as tourists they discover the traditional enemy. Hans Heysel was just 18 when he was posted to German naval headquarters in Paris on the Place de la Concorde. It was wonderful. This time in my life I was in Paris, and I discovered this wonderful city. You see, I was from Leverkusen, from a working-class family. The largest city I had ever seen before was Cologne. I had never been further away than that, and I could only dream of Paris. It was a wonderful feeling to be in the city, to be able to discover it.
Ich liebe das Leben und hab den Männern viel zu geben. Meinem schlechten Ruf verpflichtet, tu ich, was ich tun muss.
Visiting Paris on the 28th of June 1940, just after the armistice, Hitler issued the order that France, of which he admired its heritage but considered it decadent, would not play any future political role. It was to be just a cultural showcase of the new Europe under German domination. German soldiers are encouraged to explore the city the French do not deserve, and which they believe will be reborn thanks to Germany. A seemingly empty capital. A beautiful fantasy. At least to judge from the German amateur films, shot in the first weeks of occupation. The French woman was somehow a sex symbol. French men had nothing to do with it. France, Paris was about women. One day I wanted to go to the opera, and there I was standing outside, very sad, as it was Faust. That was the only real opera the French had managed to compose, by Charles Gounod. They must have noticed that I was disappointed because a French couple arrived, and they took me under their wing, and I watched Faust from the second row. Despite the clandestine opposition of a minority of French, notably the Gaullists, the first months of occupation passed relatively smoothly. Most make the best out of life with the Germans, like this young woman, Renée Pénin, filmed at the Butte Chaumont in Paris. It always seemed to me that the Germans were very well behaved. They had orders to be correct with the population of the countries they occupied. I thought, well, we were beaten, we're occupied, and it's fair game, so to speak. There they are victorious, and actually they'd hammered us, so too bad for us, huh? No point making things more complicated than they were. So it was up to us to make the best of it, of this occupation. There is plenty of evidence of the early days of occupation, which can be difficult to interpret today. Including these beautiful photos taken by Trooper Boltz in Normandy. Here's my father in a... I don't know where exactly. As far as they were concerned, the war was over. He would send the pictures home to Germany to reassure his family. His son, Rudolf Boltz, remembers it well. It was very nice. My father could drive around in the car along the coast, time with the local people, as you can see in the photo. This is another one taken in a restaurant or something like that. Me too. Nowadays, if I was on vacation and they treated me well, I would take pictures like that to remember, as it was nice. And here we see stores full of products despite the war. You know, for us in Germany, the shops weren't so full then. And there you could buy everything. My father was very proud to keep the receipts of everything he bought in those stores. You can see it wasn't always as bad as they say, in my opinion. Because there, everything is peaceful, and this is how you should behave with people. None of them seem unhappy. It looks so peaceful. At 10 years old, kids don't think. More deeply than that. It's an idealized vision that almost makes you forget the occupation was exercised by force. Listen to what most French people had to say at the beginning of 1941, when they couldn't begin to imagine what the Nazi regime had in store for them. You put up with them. After, you get used to it, and then, well, if you have one that lives with you... At first, cross the room, come and say hello. That's what they did. And then, well, we invited him to coffee. It was almost part of the family, which is saying something. And if you spoke a little French, he'd explain that he had his wife and children over there and that he would like to see them again. They showed us pictures of their children. They were very, very nice to us.
Très, très gentils.
There was one who was an artist, I remember. He painted, and another who was a musician. The one who was an artist often went to the banks of the River Rhone or forest to paint. Quietly got on with their hobbies. They never bothered us. Never.
Wir konnten ja nicht erwarten,
We didn't expect to be loved because we were the enemy after all.
gewesen, dass sie uns lieben. Aber an für sich habe ich nie.
But I never had any problems with a French civilian.
Mit einem französischen Zivilisten.
Maybe I was lucky, but I never had any problems.
Habe ich immer Glück gehabt oder weiß ich, aber ich habe nie da.
I behaved normally. They respected me, and I respected them.
Damit dann haben die mich auch. Die haben mich respektiert und ich habe sie respektiert, nicht wahr?
In the German army, there were certainly Germans who were not thrilled to fight.
Les Allemands, qui n'étaient pas enchantés de partir. C'est toujours pareil.
It's the same everywhere. They were ordinary men like us. I'm sure they weren't all supporters of Hitler.
Hitlériens.
Until 1942, the SS are a rare sight. France is occupied by the regular army, the Wehrmacht. We tried to apologize, telling the French we were not there of our own free will, we were following orders. And they understood perfectly, because often their brothers or fathers were in Germany. The first farmer in whose house we were staying had a son who was a prisoner on a farm in Germany, and who once wrote, "I'm fine." And therefore, the relationship with our host was positive, at least decent, and later even pleasant. An unreal atmosphere, and certainly not what we believe from the history of the period. Looking at the photographs, the occupation looks pleasant enough. Young Heinz Heit lived in the Oise and knew the young people of the village. He formed a friendship with this girl, Vivian. The only thing that interested her was to dance. It was great, of course, to hold this little gracious thing in my arms. It was just friendship. It was a great way to pass the time. That's all. And I would say it was just perfect.
Hingekriegt, würde ich sagen.
Between the girl and the soldier, the relationship remained platonic. She survived the war, writing through a third party until 1947, when Vivian married and disappears off the radar. It was surprising, but not an isolated incident. The Germans seem to have strongly affected a part of French society. As shown in this film, shot by a German soldier, which shows French intellectuals, including the writer Jean Cocteau, socializing with the occupiers. What's wrong with drinking with the officers in civilian clothes? He seems to be saying. The Germans even seem to have won over the children. Listen to what these little girls on their bikes have to say 70 years later. Well, my memory of the Germans, it was the best. They had horses. They had lovely black boots, and they were as handsome as anything. I was in awe of the Germans. They had these amazing uniforms, those that were staying close by anyway. And then they rode on their horses. To us, it was just beautiful. And they played with us a little, you know. But in the family, the Germans were the devil, the enemy. We were told we shouldn't play with them or be with them at all. The villa where we were staying had a roof terrace, and it was good weather. In the afternoon, I'd stripped to sunbathe. Now, 2 or 3 days later, I passed 2 young women in the street. And one of them said, "We saw your whole body." And so I asked, "So, how was it?" "We looked at you through our binoculars from up there." And I said, "Well, you've had your fun then." We were pretty. We didn't have much. We chatted, you know, we girls. Better look out. And we used the curtains to make dresses, because at that time everything was restricted. It was 45, 46 kilos, so we made clothes that puffed up, with short skirts and with petticoats, of course. But there were girls, they were naughty, because I'm not saying they seduced them, but they seemed to say, "Look, look, you see what's under your nose? Look." Me, I didn't do that because I was too scared. And one last clip showing the charm exerted by the Germans. It was filmed by the soldier in the leather coat, Otto Messerschmitt. It's not clear when he arrived in France. What's known is that he passed through Belgium before he came to Paris. That the woman he calls Esmelda is his mistress. His caption reads, "You forever." This one, an intimate moment. timeless theme, such as lovers the world over may have filmed. The war did not exist. Let's go to bed. Clearly a love story. Deniably, there were thousands more. Were these home movies shot by the Germans, while authentic, nonetheless misleading? Imagine you were these French merchants. How could you not smile to soldiers who smile at you and are filming you? The French, the Germans' behavior. Other films shed light on the Nazis' true intentions. Here, in a small town south of Paris, the Germans are removing a statue that will soon be melted for its bronze. And here in Belgium, a bell will suffer the same fate. And all these bicycles that have been requisitioned. Petty objects, possibly. But look at this. It shows a country being pillaged. Since the armistice of June 1940, France is paying 400 million francs each day to Nazi Germany. An extremely heavy tribute. Demarcation line. As the film shot by customs official Victor Barbe shows, France is divided into two, the occupied zone in the north and the so-called free zone to the south. The boundary separates families, prevents trade, and ruins the country. The Germans might behave correctly, perhaps as a way to lull the French to make them forget the sacking of their country and the 1,500,000 prisoners held in Germany. In the city of Troyes, Robert Marot, age 17, from a family of industrialists, is not fooled by the German tactics. There was German propaganda, which said the Germans are nice, soldiers will help you, and so on. And there were posters, German soldier patting the head of a kid. Next, he might even be bottle feeding him. So there was propaganda. The German soldier is good, the soldier is polite, he pays for what he buys, the soldier. Yes, but with our money. It's difficult today, 70 years later, to imagine the choices that were available to the French. To keep their jobs and feed their families, many accepted dealing with the occupier. At Troyes, the Marots are in a difficult position. Well, we had to live. We needed to have the manpower to make the factory work. Since we produced dyes, we worked. A grey-green dye for the German army. We worked for the Germans. Not only for the Germans, not just for the Germans, but the Germans gave us work in order to dress their troops. And we had the largest plant, and it was working full-time. But there were small plants, our competitors, I guess, that weren't working. They weren't allowed to. That tells you that we couldn't do whatever we wanted. And if we were working, it's because the Germans allowed us to work. Could work, but for them. Simple as that. You don't want to work for us? Fine. Coal, no this, no that. Finished. There's much worse. In 1940, Hitler annexed Alsace-Lorraine, in complete violation of the armistice. This amateur film clearly shows that any connection or history relating to France was erased. The Nazis enlist teenagers into the Hitler Youth. Will soon be sent to the Russian front. And the repression that becomes increasingly severe begins to affect the entire occupied area. Arrests, raids, executions of hostages. By 1941, any challenge to the German presence is paid for in blood. So we left the cinema one day, and a German staff car comes along with officers, and they make us line up alongside the wall and put our hands on our heads. My father had understood. He told me, well, that's it, we're ready. We'll be shot. But we stayed like that a good half hour. Another car with soldiers has pulled up meanwhile, but an officer says, you can free them, we have enough. And we were released. There'd been an attack, you see, and a German officer had been killed in the neighborhood. They took 20 hostages to be shot. And my parents' apartment overlooked the fort at Romainville. And every morning at 5 o'clock, we heard the machine gun. Shot the guys who'd been condemned to death. Every morning. I asked my father, what's that? And he'd say, it's 5 o'clock. That's still some of the guys they arrested yesterday.
Quel est cet affreux bipède, haut des super aquilins, à l'expression vile et laide, à la lippe zinzolin, qui se fait avec...
Overall, the Germans were well behaved, even kindly, but not to everyone.
Vous le demande, vous répondez tous en chœur, c'est Youpin, c'est toujours le seul Youpin. Oui, c'est extrêmement simple, vous n'avez qu'à reprendre avec nous en chœur. C'est Youpin, c'est toujours le seul Youpin.
This rare footage perfectly illustrates the virulent anti-Semitism of the time. It shows the Blois family, a French Jewish family hiding in Paris, in the middle of the occupation. In this apartment, a baby girl is born. Her name is Martine. She and her family could be arrested at any moment. Her parents, who were able to smuggle a small camera with them, decided to film her birth. They simply pretended the Germans weren't there. They put on costumes and make-believe having the baby registered by her sister at the town hall. Her birth is then announced in the newspapers and on the radio. And there's a party, to which the uncles and aunts, who are also in hiding, are invited too. It's all to ward off bad luck, hoping to survive the Nazis. For Hitler, France must be purged of its impure elements, the Jews. From the spring of 1941, and soon to be aided by the Vichy regime, the Germans arrest and then deport the Jews. The first targets are foreigners, such as the Rudis and Sidleckis, who had arrived from Poland in the 1930s. Here's Leon, 10 years old at the time, with his aunt and her daughter, wearing the yellow Star of David.
Now,
this is my aunt and me. We're outside the house. In fact, we are in a haven of peace and solitude. It's very well protected.
Très préservé.
For in this alley in the east of Paris, at the height of the occupation, a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Jacob, protects Leon. They're Protestants, who, like many other French people, begin to realize the full horror of Nazism. I'm a miraculous survivor, thanks to Mr. and Mrs. Jacob, who unfortunately are no longer there. Jacob did what his heart told him to do, say his duty, because for me it's a big word, but he had a heart. He had to save people, and he did. Everyone knew we were Jewish, and there were no problems. Even at Villa Gaudin, people came to warn us that there would be problems. And to me, the people I was with all those years, the French, were wonderful. It's still hard to imagine how human beings could have been led to slaughter. Remember that the Germans were among the leading nations at the time in terms of education, music, literature. They were educated, humane people, sensitive.
Éduqués, sensibles.
It's still one of their boasts today. And yet the humane being changed brutally because they'd been promised bread and freeways.
Des autoroutes.
Did the German soldiers support the Nazis' plans for France? What burden of responsibility do they carry for the crimes committed? It's a hard question to answer. Most focused on their military duties, claims this artilleryman who was born in 1917, Ruprecht Kreutzberger. We're trying to save our own skin as soldiers, whenever possible. We thought of nothing else. We had no rights, we soldiers. It's the duty to follow our leaders. It was an obligation you couldn't refuse. It would have been considered desertion. Deserters were lined up against the wall and they were shot. I'm not a soldier by nature. But you had to do it, or you'd be put up against the wall. Prussian approach to soldiering. You don't question orders, you just carry them out. The rule is that no officer and no soldier should know any more than what is necessary for the execution of his order. Not challenge an order. Why are we doing this? It was simply part of military education in Germany. We had neither the time nor the ability to think. It was all banged into our heads and we just did it.
Nachgeplappert.
At first I was too young, and later I didn't care about the politics anyway. The key was to get home in one piece, to get out of where we had no business to be. You had to get back home. So the big political issue was, what do we eat tomorrow? This is what we thought about. Very young soldiers, highly trained. Some confident in German military success, others terrified. Very few, even in retrospect, challenged their attitude back then. Hans Heysel of the German Navy is an exception.
All
soldiers, from the highest rank to the lowest, said, "We must carry out our orders. We swore an oath to the Führer." They said, "The Führer orders, we must obey." And that's what we did. But they refused to admit to any crimes. It shows the fanatical and idiotic attitude of the German soldiers. It's really sad. They were so uncritical. They preferred to die. But I thought, if I die in this war, I want to know what for. So the occupation continues until towards the end of 1942. After the first shock, the French are beginning to realize that behind the veneer of civilized behavior, the Germans are capable of limitless brutality. And however it might upset the Germans, despite the apparent calm, the war with France is far from over. As we shall see in part 2 of this documentary. Spring 1943. The German occupation of France is already 3 years old. In a river north of Paris, teenagers go swimming as if nothing's unusual. And they bring their cameras. Guy Trinquet was 17 years old at the time. We wanted to do something, to be active, to try in spite of everything, to participate in the future liberation. And that's it. Nobody knows about it, not even his girlfriend. Guy Trinquet is a member of a resistance network against the occupier. The only feeling we had was that they should leave as fast as possible, and that we had to do everything in our power to make sure they did. Forgotten by now was the German victory, the smiles and disarming politeness. With the domination of France by the SS in 1942, and the invasion of the Free Zone in the south, plus the persecutions, the split with the occupants is widening. I knew that I had to be careful. I was taking the tube a lot, and I wasn't standing too close to the doors. Someone could open the doors and just push you out. With the home movies and pictures found in private homes and collections, the story of the years of occupation continues, as the French and the Germans observe each other warily.
Schützenhaus ist Blasmusik mit Tanz. Da tanzt die Lieselott mit ihrem Franz. Da wird der kleine Amor
A show for German soldiers in Paris. Since the German offensive against the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, France has become a rear base for the soldiers of the Wehrmacht. A quiet zone where soldiers are sent to rest.
Wer an Sorgen denkt, der wird nicht froh. Wo ein Lied klingt nach das Glück kommt, singt mit mir, trinkt mit mir.
Wo wir zurückgekommen sind von
When we returned from Russia, we were sent to Saint-Brieuc. They wanted to reform our unit before leaving.
Und dann sagten dann hier die neuen.
And the new soldiers said, "When are we leaving?"
Da habe ich gesagt,
Well, I told them, "You should be glad we're here."
der hätte den Krieg
I would have liked to end the war here.
in dieser Form.
They continue filming France as if they were on vacation. But as the occupation drags on, the attitude of the French is changing. In any case, there were too many of them, far too many. We saw them everywhere. Everywhere they were. There were Germans everywhere. All those boots marching non-stop. One day I crossed a convoy, and then I found myself on the sidewalk. It bothered them to see that we were not nice. If they greeted us, we didn't answer. It was as if we didn't see them. You're here? Fine. Stay there, do whatever you want, but we don't want to see you. We do our own little thing. We come, we go, and you're not there. As soon as they arrived somewhere, it was the Nazi salute. They were coming to the store and they asked me for markers, but with an air of, how do you say it? Stumm. But not in a nice way. They were not nice people. They could have been softer in the way that they bought things. They didn't like us much anyway, but they did love Paris. French behavior is full of subtlety and finesse. When we were in the metro and one of them walked in front of us, he'd say, "Sorry," and he went through the door politely. I'd hope no one did that. As for me, personally, I have sometimes thought that we behave like rednecks in France.
Wie ein Klotz in Frankreich, ja.
Die schöne, die schöne wilde, führt immer was im Schilde, wenn's die Liebe geht. Die schöne, die wilde.
Their standard of living, in particular, doesn't go down well. The conquerors have a favorable exchange rate in relation to the Reichsmark. Everywhere, they help themselves first.
Ja, da gab's noch viel zu essen. Ja, in der Bretagne.
There's still a lot to eat in Brittany, in the local restaurants where you could enjoy a good drink too.
Ein paar Lokale mit den
And once we sang the Internationale, but we changed the words to "People, eat more bananas and you will remain healthy."
Völker esst mehr Bananen und ihr bleibet gesund.
Jokes that no longer made one laugh. As shown in a film shot in secret by the liberated family in Normandy. An increasing number of French people don't have enough to eat. Looting by the Germans is now affecting everyone. There was nothing in the stores, or almost nothing. They received very little stuff. There was nothing nowhere. We couldn't find anything anywhere. There was nothing to eat. No clothes, we had no shoes, no meat, no poultry, there was nothing. We were starving. Only half a pig at the butcher's for the whole week. It was the Germans who took everything. They left very little. The Germans had to be fed first. One day I was leaving work, and as I was always very hungry in those days, I saw two Germans in front of me on the sidewalk, eating a soldier's ration biscuit. I followed them and I said, "Look, they're eating." Eating was an obsession. And one of the soldiers threw the biscuit on the ground. And what do you think I did? Well, I picked it up, and I was ashamed. Oh, if you only knew how ashamed I felt to do this. I still think about it, because I said to myself, if they see me do that. So I removed the part with the teeth marks and I ate the biscuit. You really have to be hungry to do something like that. The Germans film such scenes and revel in the situations of dependency. Like Captain Gurka from the 23rd Infantry Regiment. In France, tens of thousands of women have affairs with the occupier. For many, it's a means of survival. They were in distress. There weren't many men, and those that were around were old. The young men had gone to the war. There were many prisoners, a lot of them. In our family, I don't know how many of them we had, 7 or 8 at least, who were all prisoners. All our men were prisoners. The terrace of the Hotel Maurice, the German High Command headquarters in Paris. This is where Heinz Lorenz, on the left, worked. The officer in charge of organizing recreation for the soldiers was enjoying life to the full. His standard of living was enviable. He was filmed with French mistresses. Easy indeed for this family man from Berlin to play the role of protector in times of trouble. Women who had children to feed and didn't have a husband anymore. The husband was a prisoner, there was no work, money was needed. For a pass. Why not? The pass. A little attention. Some assistance, some support in difficult times. Not prostitution necessarily, but one can make the most of those in charge.
Moi, je suis une petite fleur qui a connu bien des malheurs. sais bien comment les attraper.
For most French, these affairs are unacceptable.
En des airs de jeune fille, dans une robe
And so believes this young woman, Geneviève Christophe, filmed in 1943 performing amateur dramatics.
et puis je tourne la tête et je m'en vais faire la fête.
Ben, je pensais que
I thought they were hooers. There's no other word for it.
autrement.
And then,
Quand même,
anyway,
en plus,
to get closer to the enemy like that,
se rapprocher de l'ennemi comme ça.
those people must not have loved their country.
Son pays.
They were
C'étaient des
traitors.
traîtres. Elle
They were somehow taking advantage of good supplies.
d'un bon ravitaillement.
There was no new clothes to put on for most of us,
Rien à se mettre.
but these ladies wore new clothes.
Ces dames portaient des habits neufs, etc. C'était... J'ai connu une personne qui habitait rue Gambetta.
I knew someone who lived in Rue Gambetta alongside the railway,
Elle a vu des personnes,
and she saw people with packages that came from the Germans.
les paquets portés par l'ordonnance allemande.
People began hanging around with the Germans because they lacked everything. Can we really throw stones at them for doing so? When you're in such a situation, of course, once the guy is naked, in bed, well, he's a man, period. There's no mark on his cock saying he's German. There's no swastika. These are rare images from a French prison camp in Austria, Offlag 17A, filmed at the same time. They were taken without the knowledge of the German guards with a hidden camera that had been smuggled into the camp. It shows the defeated French troops of 1940 wasting their lives in a continuous and depressing cycle of religious processions and entertainment for prisoners. Uniquely, the amateur film has recorded a remarkable scene. Preparations for an escape unfold before our eyes. To end their humiliation, 100 officers are digging a tunnel under the barbed wire. Among them, Jean-Cune Grandidier. We were wasting the best years of our lives, and for what? Because the politicians of the Third Republic had given up on us and had not been able to lead France to victory. But there was, after all, the call from General de Gaulle. That was an incentive to follow his example. We didn't escape just to go for a walk, you know, and I want to emphasize that point. We all made a commitment to take up arms against the enemy. It wasn't about going for a stroll or going to Vienna to live the good life. It was about resuming the fight against the Germans. They're only a small minority, but the French begin to reject defeat. On November 11th, 1943, an event takes place that marks a turning point in the history of the German occupation. At Oyonnax, near the border with Switzerland, dozens of resistance fighters, the Maquisards, turn up out of the blue and under the noses of the Germans and march towards the war memorial to honor their elders of the Great War. One inhabitant, Raymond Rouleau, and his son, Pierre, films the symbol of rebirth from his window. What made the most impact were the order, discipline, and perfect organization of that day. We felt it was the beginnings of a small army. They were led by soldiers who seemed to be respected. And everything worked so well, we suddenly had the feeling that the resistance wasn't just a random group of people who lived in the woods, but that it was a real secret organization that did exist and on which we could rely. It was in reaction to the propaganda that never missed an opportunity to discredit the maquis, the resistance fighters who were presented as terrorists, who only enjoyed stealing money or acting like gangsters. To the Germans, France had, by signing the armistice, given up on any military action. Those who take up the fight, as shown in this amateur film shot in Brittany, don't respect the laws of war. To the Germans, they are terrorists.
Partisans sind nie uniformiert.
Partisans didn't wear uniform. It was the same in Russia, Italy, and Yugoslavia. It gave them an advantage. They could come and go easily, strike out of nowhere. The word maquis in French means the shrubs. We weren't scared of the Americans, but we did fear the maquis.
Die Partisanen habe ich kein Verständnis.
I couldn't accept what the partisans were doing.
In keinem Land akzeptiert wird.
The war they waged wasn't recognized by any country.
In meinem Sinne und auch im Sinne der Genfer Konvention.
In my opinion, and according to the Geneva Convention, they weren't soldiers and the laws of war didn't apply.
Angewandt, sondern
so when you shoot, you shoot. In other words,
da wird dann geschossen, ja. Das ist,
they will be annihilated.
Kann man sagen, die werden vernichtet.
Nevertheless, some Germans disobey. Like Hans Heisel, who is now 23 years old and is still in the General Staff of the Navy. Thanks to meetings, including with a member of the German opposition, Hans becomes aware of the criminal policies of Nazism.
Das war ein Sozialdemokrat.
It was a social democrat, but from the left,
Dessen Brüder
and whose brothers had been arrested by the Gestapo in Wuppertal.
inhaftiert worden sind in Wuppertal. Und der mir dann
He told me
erzählt
what the
hat,
Nazis
was
had
die
done
Nazis
in
für
his
seinen
city.
Ort so alles gemacht haben. Sie haben
They
einen
had
Bruder
tortured
von
one of
ihm
his brothers,
gefoltert
and another was sent
und
to a
einer ist ins
concentration
KZ
camp.
gekommen. Das war für mich ganz neu, davon habe ich überhaupt keine Ahnung gehabt. Und das hat
It was
in
all
meinem
very new to me. I had no
Prozess
idea.
etwas dazu beigetragen. Ja, zu denken
And as I learnt
darüber,
about it, it made
weshalb
me ask
bin ich
myself,
denn
why am I
überhaupt
here?
hier?
What role do I
Welche
objectively
Rolle spiele
play
ich
in this war?
objektiv in diesem Krieg?
After several months of reflection, Hans Heisel secretly joins the French Communist Party, all the while remaining at his post. He also agrees to supply weapons which will likely be used to fight and kill his compatriots. As for me, I was completely opposed to the idea of taking a gun to kill a German. I was completely opposed to it. It was the communists who did this. As far as I'm concerned, it's not resistance, if I dare say. It was useless, it was very cowardly. Once a German was shot, hostages were taken, and they were shot. It served no point at all. Real resistance was to do everything each of us could in his own way. As far as the Maquis, they were the armed resistance, and by that time we were fighting. It was a real war. It was a proper war. I thought we had to free the German people from these criminals. That was the reason. I felt that if I hadn't done anything, and knowing they were criminals of the highest order, I couldn't have looked myself in the mirror. They didn't represent my country. On the contrary, they were criminals who had sullied the name of Germany throughout the world. So how should one deal with Nazi Germany? As these films from 1943 show, two minorities exist side by side, one resisting, the other collaborating. To imitate Germany to help France get back on its feet. The head of the militia is Joseph Darnan, a First World War hero and a future member of the Waffen-SS. But some followers lost their way, such as André Gimel, who filmed the ceremony in the Savoie, a home movie enthusiast. He writes in his diary, "The faces of the militiamen are severe and harsh. The martyrs of National Socialism are its strength and greatness. Their doctrine will defeat their bitterest enemies, the Jews, the communists, the black marketeers." Stuck in between are the majority of French people, torn apart and entangled in contradictions. Such as the Ferret family, also in the Savoie, that films Marshal Pétain, the man who made the choice of collaboration, the one who puts his police force in the service of Jewish persecution and repression of the resistance. To many French people, especially the young Gabriel Ferret, 15 at the time, Pétain, the hero of the First World War, was the only one able to stand up to the Germans. It was a little like Joan of Arc, if you will, in my mind anyway. As a little girl, I thought he was like Joan of Arc, and all those who sacrificed themselves for France. He would probably save us, but I didn't know how. Oh, there was no doubt the Germans were our enemies. They were the hereditary enemies. They were those who had killed my uncle, those who had hurt others. Oh yes, they were our enemies. It wasn't the Germans who were going to teach us that, no. It would be national revival, as we said at the time. Either indifferent or misled by the reassuring image of Marshal Pétain, the French seem not to realize the extent of Nazi persecution. In Pithiviers, south of Paris, the Imbeau family are filming daily life without worrying too much about the fate of the Jews, who are imprisoned in a camp on the outskirts of the town. Flashback to 1940, when the base is being used by the French military. In this, the same site, thousands of Jewish people will be imprisoned, including women and children, all of them arrested during the infamous winter velodrome roundup, before being deported to Auschwitz. We had no idea what was happening to the Jews in the camp. We lived in town. So did we have a sheltered life? I don't know. But we didn't realize what was happening around us. The Jews came to Pithiviers station and were taken by convoy directly to the camp. They weren't mistreated. They were taken in a procession, in rows, in columns to the camp. But we confined them there, and at first they were taken, escorted by gendarmes, French gendarmes. They were taken to run some errands in town. For the inhabitants to see people in town accompanied by the French gendarmes, it then seemed all right. Therefore, many people didn't ask questions. Once I asked my mother about what she knew about the camp. I think she was embarrassed because she didn't know how to answer. The only thing she told me is that occasionally, when they came to run their errands, they were throwing or leaving bits of papers behind, some of them with addresses written on it. And my parents were sending those papers off by mail. Well, that's all. I think they were fooled. They were deceived by the presence of French gendarmes. That's for sure. I felt very guilty. Very, very guilty to have lived a life. I would say that it had been relatively quiet. And then there's this huge injustice. It's horrible. When I learned little by little what had happened, the Jews being arrested at the time, I knew nothing about it. The fact that such a destructive system had been set up by men against other men. I had a certain idea of what humanity should be, but this was beyond anything. How should the French be judged 70 years later? Collaborators? Resistance fighters? What do the enigmatic smiles reveal? Robert Brochure lives in La Rochelle. He's a photographer. His shop was requisitioned by the Germans to develop pictures taken by their soldiers. This is a good example. Okay, well, we did collaborate. Let's tell it the way it was. Everyone collaborated. We all did. The baker collaborated, the pastry chef collaborated. We accepted them, but as customers. Not as the German army, but as clients. They were seen as customers, period. And later we talked. When we knew a little more German, we talked to them. We asked them where they came from. One of his clients was called Friedrich. We were exactly the same age, 21. He was from Frankfurt on Main, and he used to drop by the house. We closed the front door, and every evening at 8 o'clock, for the 3 months he was there, we'd listen to London, the French, speak to the French on the BBC. And he'd also listen to this. He had his own ideas about Germany, not the ideas of Heil Hitler. A simple German citizen, as they are today. In secret, in his laboratory, Robert Brochure decides to duplicate all the photos the Germans give him to develop. 700 altogether, to be used as evidence later. He was running a huge risk, what with the atrocities and the military secrets. He could have faced the death penalty. And what if this is what the French were like during the occupation? They accommodated the Germans, and at the same time resisted them too, without even realizing the contradiction. It became a kind of double thinking, a schizophrenia. Another episode from The Juror. Victor Barb, the customs officer who had filmed the arrival of the Germans in 1940, is now a translator. He's a kind of intermediary with the locals. With his wife, he spends time with them. Especially with the soldier Bauer, who he will continue to see after the war. And this doesn't prevent him from filming an anti-German scene, despite a ban. People had thrown nails on the road to puncture the tires of the Germans. The locals are requisitioned. And things turn to farce. As the nails are not swept away, but into the middle of the road. It ends with a parody of a military review, when a fake German is greeted by an army of sweepers. Warning, this is a statement from the 1st Anti-Aircraft Division of Berlin. We are informed that squadrons of bombers are flying over the region of Hanover and Braunschweig. We will keep you informed. The war will soon be 4 years old, and to the Germans, the allure of France is now a distant memory. I am asking you, do you want total war? From Brittany, Klaus Kendler writes to his parents in Berlin. I'm starting to get tired. I've seen so much stuff. My best years are slipping away. I'm tired of France, except Paris. The most terrible thing is that one doesn't see an end to it. In 4 days, I will be 22. I can't believe it. Last year, I was in Russia. Now I'm in France. Next year, where will I be? I was getting older, and there was no end in sight to the war. But it was obvious it wasn't going to end well. There'd been Stalingrad and North Africa afterwards, and we thought to ourselves that it would end in a disaster. Those who still believed the war might be won were living in a fantasy world. I'd received a huge bouquet of flowers at work. And when I got out of work, not knowing who had sent me the flowers, then I saw a German uniform following behind. and I could hear the sound of his boots. The noise of his boots, it's terrible, I can still hear it. Anyway, this German followed me to the Saint-Lazare station in tears, telling me he wanted to talk to a woman before dying. He was leaving for the Russian front. So I talked to him, but rudely, because I was very cross with the Germans. I said there was nothing to eat, you have deprived us of everything. My brother was arrested by the Gestapo and so on. And then he opened his wallet and gave me all his coupons. And I left him there like that. I left him on the sidewalk, crying. He was crying. It haunts my memory. As I say, this man probably died right away because he was so afraid of dying. And maybe he was very kind. I mean, the proof is that he wanted to talk to a woman before dying. That's not malicious, is it? In 1944, France again becomes a battleground. The Allies bomb the country ferociously. In Normandy, Huguette and Jean-Yves Le Bihan, who filmed the queues in front of shops, narrowly escaped death several times. An unbelievable fear. That's what bombing is. It's awful. After, we'd say, the Americans are hitting away from high up, because they had destroyed so many houses in Évreux. There'd been a big bombardment. 220 dead. They had no choice. They had to get rid of the Germans. In that period, the Germans became so aggressive. It had to end. It couldn't last anymore, even if others had to pay the price. There weren't many other solutions to getting rid of the Germans. No, for sure. This kind of terrible war destroys so many things.
De guerre terrible.
Allied bombing causes 60,000 deaths, more than the German bombings in 1940. The Germans tried to take advantage by attending funerals of the victims and by being compassionate, like here in Belgium. Yet their propaganda fails to make people forget the atrocities committed by their own troops. The SS were now part of the frontline units of the Wehrmacht, and they fiercely repress the resistance fighters without sparing civilians. The last German who I spoke to was Waffen-SS. And of course, the question he asked me was if I knew where the terrorists were. They didn't call them resistance, of course. Can you imagine it, asking such a thing to a young French woman? Anyway, the Waffen-SS wouldn't stop at anything. With defeat approaching, the Germans stopped filming in France. There is no footage of the thousands of Jews who continue to be deported to the east. Very few photos of the hundreds of massacres, such as this one committed at Lantilly in Burgundy a few days before the D-Day landings. Most films from the summer of 1944 are being shot by the French to show how the Germans are treating France. At Dorton, in the Jura, Raymond Rouleau is filming a torture stake, a common grave, and the village that has been destroyed. The Germans came by road and began to massacre the population and burn villages. The villagers had fled into the forest, fearing the Germans. And the Germans organized a sweep of the forests, and they considered all the people who were outside of the village to be with the resistance. Therefore, they were deported. Some were tortured. It was very bloody. By this point, we were terrified of them. We said this couldn't be real. We couldn't understand. We'd seen men who were just like us before, and then now they were behaving like savages. Well, they felt they were going to lose the war, fine, but they were so vicious. At the time, we changed our opinion of the German army. It was no longer a splendid and well-organized force. It had turned into a kind of dubious rout, and we were dismayed to see those people behaving like brutes. But at the same time, reassured, because we thought that with these kind of people, the army wouldn't survive long. From June the 6th, 1944, the date of the Allied landings in Normandy, the struggle is reversed as the Germans, under the eyes of the French, begin their retreat. When the front collapsed in Normandy, everything happened very fast. The main units were beaten. It was a terrible retreat. But we wore the uniform, and to desert meant being put up in front of a wall, and who wanted that? We'd been given weapons, vehicles, and we were still proud of our unit, of our artillery. Before leaving, Heinz Heit has just enough time to say goodbye to his French friend, Vivian. She was at the window, and I was in the street. She didn't come out. She stayed up in the apartment. We just exchanged a few sentences. She said, "Dank an mich," which I didn't understand at first. This meant in German, "think of me," with a French accent. These are the only German words she ever said to me. Nothing spectacular, really. On one hand, we were scared. On the other hand, a beautiful friendship was coming to an end. We tried to act as normally as possible. From her window, Huguette Le Bihan films the troops pulling out. I remember the Germans were looking for any transport, even bicycles, to get away, because they were afraid the Americans were arriving. They left on whatever they could find, cars or bikes. I even saw one German on a horse, as in that movie, The Longest Day. It was pathetic. They took anything to save themselves. It was their exodus. For months, I had diarrhea. I was so scared. All these whistles in the air, the total superiority of the Americans in the sky. We just said to ourselves, how long is this going to keep on?
On allait presque jusqu'à les plaindre.
We were almost pitying them because we were telling ourselves, look at them now.
Ça faisait une sacrée différence.
It was a hell of a difference.
On se disait, ben,
We were saying, you see, now it's your turn. What we said didn't hurt them, of course, just their sense of pride and the dignity of the Great Reich. And then, well, then we saw the GIs. The GIs, a completely different story. In Normandy, Huguette and Jean-Yves Le Bihan rush with their cameras to the first Americans. I asked him, where were they going? And they told me they were going towards eastern France as quickly as they could.
Rapidement, quickly. Et voilà.
The story now is of a population trying to reconnect with its destiny. In Paris, without waiting for the Allies, people rise up. Among them is the German Hans Heisel.
Man steht morgens auf.
We get up in the morning, or we go out, and we see posters everywhere. French people, Parisians, take up arms. Let's release our city. It was perhaps a bit like the Great French Revolution.
Da waren auf den Straßen da Männer, Frauen, Kinder.
In the streets, there were men, women, and children who built barricades with great enthusiasm. No more German soldier dared cross the city, but there were tanks everywhere. I saw one go down one street, and the residents threw Molotov cocktails from the window and onto the roof of the tank until it caught fire.
Bis der in Flammen aufging.
The story of a humiliation, which once again changes sides. It wasn't possible to make an exit any worse than this. It was our 0 hour. I felt like a loser. Yes, I had lost the war. I personally had lost the war as a prisoner. I saw German prisoners of the Gare du Nord coming out with their hands on their heads. It was the Free French who had dislodged them, and everyone was spitting on them. They were covered in spit. It was really horrible. It shocked me terribly. I mean, despite the fact that they were our enemies then, I don't think I would have done that. Did they understand what was happening to them? Not always. One of those Germans who has just been arrested is Walter Dreisner. For months, he has been taking pictures of France, as the Germans fantasized it. Apolitical and sensual. His last photos are from July 1944, taken at a swimming pool with his French friends. He wrote in his journal, "We're being pushed around by the blacks from the Leclerc division. A wave of insults rains down on us. On On the Rue de Rivoli, the guy who's in front of me gets punched on the chin and falls. A French guy takes a bike and throws it at us, we who are helpless. They take it out on us, who are in many cases innocent. In Paris, no one would treat an animal like that. No, as far as I'm concerned, they're not friends. Those who fight for the Nazis are not friends. Of course, they have to be taken away. And they should be treated as criminals. They are responsible for all of this. I might be sorry for them to be captured like that, but they still have the chance to save their lives. Yes, it was very humiliating. And besides, it was understandable that we were treated that way. Even though it wasn't fair, people said Germans equal Nazis, which was not true for most of us. See the Germans being defeated, I can assure you, was really comforting. Oh, in many ways. Oh, yes. Revenge. As far as we're concerned, France was not the winner in 1945. It may have been part of the victors because she had decided to be on their side. But the war in France, it was the Americans who won it. And so ends the war. And with it, a secular hostility between France and Germany. To the joy of all those who miraculously survived Nazism, such as young Leon Sidlecki, or the Bois family, those Alsatian Jews who are coming out of hiding to welcome the Allies with their little girls, born during the German occupation. And there's bitterness as well for the French, of having to be liberated for the most part by others, and for failing to win the war, they sometimes lost their soul. Less than 5 years after the defeat of 1940, Nazism itself was defeated, and lasting peace would be established between the two countries. Who would have imagined at the time the string of humiliations would finally be forgotten 70 years later?